Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to get started now. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to today's firing line debate. My name is Will Barbie, and I am serving as the president of the Buckley Institute for this semester. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's debate between Dr. Michael Ulrich and Dr. Ryan Anderson to debate the question, should the law only recognize biological sex? Before I introduce our guests, I'd like to say a few words about the Buckley program. The William F. Buckley Jr. program is the flagship program of the Buckley Institute, an organization dedicated to promoting intellectual diversity and open political discussion at Yale. We have hosted lectures, dinner seminars, firing line debates, and an annual conference every year since 2011. Our over 750 Buckley Fellows hold a wide range of political beliefs, but they all stand united against the formation of a liberal-only echo chamber on campus. By providing Yale students with a forum to engage meaningfully with serious, conservative thought, the Buckley program has become an institution on Yale's campus and a symbol for a more open and representative political atmosphere. Especially at a university where the mission is the cultivation and creation of new knowledge, Buckley Fellows believe that all perspectives must be heard and examined in good faith. You can learn more about the program and how to become a fellow on our website at buckleyinstitute.com. I also want to emphasize the Buckley program's commitment to freedom of speech. Disruption of an event is not consistent with Yale's policies on free expression as outlined in the Woodward Report. I would ask that each of you respect the right of our speakers to be heard and the right of your fellow audience members to listen to the event. Thank you for joining us in upholding the value of free speech. Now for our guests. Dr. Michael R. Ulrich is an associate professor of health law, ethics, and human rights at Boston University's School of Public Health and School of Law. His research focuses on the intersection of public health, constitutional law, bioethics, and social justice, with an emphasis on the role of law in the health outcomes of marginalized and underserved populations. Professor Ulrich's scholarship has appeared in national and international journals, including the Stanford Law Review, New England Journal of Medicine, Cardoso Law Review, American Journal of Bioethics, and the Yale Journal of Health Policy, Law, and Ethics. Prior to joining Boston University, Professor Ulrich was a research scholar, senior fellow in health law, and lecturer at the Yale Law School, where he helped launch and run the Solomon Center for Health Law and Policy at the school. He's also been given multiple Excellence in Teaching awards for his work in the classroom. On the other side, we have Ryan Anderson. Dr. Ryan T. Anderson is the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, a think tank which works to, quote, apply the riches of the Jewish and Christian traditions to contemporary questions of law, culture, and politics in pursuit of America's continued civic and cultural renewal. He is the author or co-author of 5 books on topics ranging from abortion to marriage to religious liberty, with one of his books of relevance to today's topic being When Harry Became Sally, Responding to the Transgender Moment. Previously, Dr. Anderson served as a senior research fellow at the Heritage Foundation, an adjunct professor of philosophy and political science at Christendom College, and an assistant editor at First Things. He also currently serves as the John Paul II Teaching Fellow in Social Thought at the University of Dallas and is a member of the James Madison Society at Princeton University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anderson and Dr. Ulrich to the Buckley Institute and to Yale. I'll just say one note on the formatting of this event. We will begin with opening statements from each of our guests, followed by brief rebuttals from each of our guests. We will then open the floor to a Q&A from the audience before ending with closing remarks. So we'll begin with Dr. Ulrich.
Great. Thank you so much, and thank you to Buckley Institute for the invitation. Very happy to be here. Thanks to everybody for coming out. So I want to start today, like any good lawyer, by answering a question with a question, right? So the question is, how should the law, or should the law only recognize biological sex? To me, then the question is, well, what exactly does that mean, right? Before we can get to the law, should it do this, right, is how do we define biological sex? And so, there are a few sort of the common ways that are most often conceived, right? So chromosomes, right? You look, are there two X's or is there an X and a Y? And so one of the ways that this is done was discovered by Murray Barr. And this is old science, but the problem with this is Murray Barr himself actually even said that whether or not there are two X's or an X and a Y is, quote, only a minor detail in the femaleness or maleness of the whole person. Right, so he discovered this, he found that, this was important and relevant, but he also is the same person who said, but this is only one part of the puzzle of how we would explain or define whether someone is male, boy, guy, man, right, or female, girl, woman. And this was in 1956, right? So one of the other things that I think is really important to keep in mind is the idea that this is some sort of new problem is not exactly true, right? As Dr. Anderson wrote in his own book, right, gender-affirming care goes back to the 30s, right? Gender identity issues go back even further. And so this is not something where this is a new problem that society is trying to grapple with, right? It's just that we are thinking about it and dealing with it in different ways. And I think this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about data that's often thrown around, right? So if we think about something like youth with gender dysphoria, the majority of them tend to revert and identify with their sex assigned at birth. And that may be true, right? But we're not really accounting for, right, how many of those sort of gender dysphoria children are boys that liked wearing dresses, right? Or girls that liked having their hair short or playing sports, and their parents were the ones saying, something's wrong, right? And so we think there must be some problem and there might need to be some treatment. Another thing that gets talked about is the rise in gender-affirming care, or people that are seeking gender-affirming care. We also have to keep in mind, this country's history on not having universal health care coverage, right? So post-Affordable Care Act, across the board, people were seeking out and accessing health care generally more than they were before the Affordable Care Act, right? When you have 50 plus million people that are uninsured versus 20 million people that are uninsured, right? That's something to keep in mind. Okay, so going back, right, another way that we could potentially do it is genitalia, right? You look and you say, is this a boy or is this a girl, right? But again, if we're thinking back to the chromosome aspect, there are people that have XX that have a penis and have testicles. There are people that have XY chromosomes that have a vagina, right? There are intersex people that have, variations of both of these. And so again, just by looking, you can't necessarily, tell, right? And so there isn't always a consistency between what's happening internally and what's seen externally. And again, this is not new or anomalous, right? This is happens in genetics all the time. There's a difference between genotype and phenotype, right? And so that's something. Reproductive capabilities is another, right? Can you get pregnant or can you not get pregnant? But then again, right, if we think about those who are unable to conceive, women that are barren, right, are we then saying, again, speaking about the law itself, are those people not qualified or fit into this sort of category of this biological sex or that biological sex? And so really when we think about it, biology is impacted by genes, it's impacted by anatomy, hormones, all of these things, and there's a lot of combinations. And so part of the problem with the idea of should there be, just male and female and that's it, is it presumes that there is a universality in each of those categories that frankly just doesn't exist, while at the same time ignoring a large swath of people that don't fit into either of those categories, right? So there is a problem with whether we would even be able to actually define only two sexes and say, this qualifies and categorizes every single person in the country. And so, I think intersex people are an especially important exception, right? Even gender-affirming care bans, for example, always allow for an exception to say, except you can do surgery on an intersex infant, right? No consent, you just pick. You pick whichever sex you want them to be, and you do surgery that will align them with that sex, right? Not medically necessary other than to fit into this binary. And so that creates both physical, medical, and psychological problems that come out down the road. And so because the law is supposed to be, at the very least, recognizing and protecting everybody, right, then we can't have these sort of gaps of people that don't fit into one of these two categories. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It pains me to say this as a Princeton graduate, but it's a pleasure to be at Yale. It's a pleasure to be here with the Buckley Institute. I spoke at one of your annual conferences, I think the second year, so it's been almost a decade since I've been on Yale's campus for the Buckley Institute. In the 5 minutes I have, I just want to make three basic points. First, the question is whether or not the law should only recognize biological sex. I answer yes, because there's no other type of sex. There's not a social sex or a cultural sex or an inner theory of sex. Biological sex is the only type of sex that exists because humans, like all other mammals, are a sexually dimorphic species, right? We're either male or female. It's based upon how we are organized for reproduction. That is both binary and stable. There are two gametes, there are two genitals, there are two reproductive systems. There's not a third genital, there's not a third gamete, nor is there a spectrum between the male and the female. There's not a spectrum between male and female reproductive organs or systems. There are disorders of sexual development, but people who experience disorders of sexual development are not a third sex, nor are they somewhere in between the two sexes. They are either a male or a female. Though they are incompletely developed, they experience a developmental disorder, and they may contain vestigial parts of the opposite sex. What's the alternative? So this leads us to point two. When people don't want to have the law recognize only biological sex, they say the law should recognize gender identity. And so we saw both during the Obama administration and then during the Biden administration, the Department of Justice, Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Education, various other federal agencies said sex is now determined by gender identity. Gender identity is someone's internal sense of gender. Huge conceptual problems here because one, you have a circular definition. Gender identity is how my inner sense of gender, but gender is now defined detached from sex. So if it's not even an inner sense of my sex, what is it an inner sense of? What is it to feel like a man, or feel like a woman, or feel like both a man and a woman, or feel like neither a man or a woman, right? Given that these things aren't feelings in the first place. Gender identity is both fluid and exists along a spectrum. And so it would also create a host of problems if the law was recognizing gender identity as the way of both defining and then recognizing sex. So my question would be, if we're not recognizing biological sex in places of federal and state and local law where sex matters, what will we be recognizing? The proponents want to say gender identity. And then my third point, it lists, it creates a whole host of problems. With the time I have, I'll mention 5. Privacy concerns. There's a reason why we have separate private places for men and for women, because there are bodily differences that make a difference. And one of the ways that you can see this, when federal law prohibited discrimination both on the basis of race and the basis of sex, that meant it prohibited race-specific bathrooms and locker rooms. Thank God we no longer have racially segregated bathrooms and locker rooms. But when it prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, it didn't get rid of women's bathrooms and locker rooms. It actually forced many institutions like this one to create women-only spaces. That recognizing equality, eliminating discrimination on the basis of sex meant creating female-only sex-based spaces precisely to protect females' privacy. Second, safety concerns. There's also a reason, not just privacy concerns, but safety concerns why we sometimes have men and women separated. Right? For the purpose of a lecture, we don't need to have men and women in different lecture halls. But when you're engaged in intimate bodily functions, when you're in a state of undress, when you're incarcerated, there are reasons why we house men and women separately. And so what we have seen in California and other jurisdictions that have allowed prisons to be determined based upon inner sense of gender, gender identity, is that men claim to be trans women, that is, they identify as women, they then get transferred to female prisons, and then they perpetrate additional sex crimes, violating the safety rights of those actual female inmates. Another safety concern has to do with physical contact sports. When male and female bodies collide, when they interact on a physical bodily level, it creates undue safety risks for women. Right? So another reason why we have separate male athletic competition and female athletic competition. All right, third area of concern is equality concerns. Leave aside physical combat sports or contact sports. Just take swimming or track. It's unfair that men who identify as women are taking podium spots from actual women. There's a reason why we have separate athletic competitions for men and women. When we prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, thank God we got rid of black-only and white-only athletic leagues. When we prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex, we had to create female-only athletic leagues and teams and equal opportunities, right? The NBA and the WNBA, not a gender-neutral NBA. One thing to highlight here, if we aren't going to do it based upon sex when it comes to private spaces, safe spaces, and equal athletic competitions, if we do it based on gender identity instead, how many different bathrooms, locker rooms, prisons, and sports teams do we need? Right? If gender is truly a spectrum, and if you can be gender ambidextrous and gender fluid and gender non-binary, why are we actually keeping the binary system of men's teams and women's teams, men's prisons, women's prisons, but then assigning people based on how they identify? Other two concerns, liberty and then bodily, and we have 1 minute left, bodily and personal integrity. When gender identity replaces sex in law, it creates a variety of liberty violations. Just two that I'll highlight is that we've had mandates both in the Obama years and Biden administrations that forced physicians to perform bad medicine, even against their conscience, even against their medical judgments. And then we also had prohibitions on good medicine. And what I mean here is that there were mandates that said if you perform a double mastectomy in the case of breast cancer, you have to perform a double mastectomy in the case of a woman who wants to, quote, identify as a man, even on minors. So those would be the mandates. And then the prohibitions was that you wouldn't even be allowed in the city of New Haven in the state of Connecticut to talk to a minor who identified as the opposite sex and help that person feel comfortable in their own body. And then finally, the reason that we shouldn't recognize gender identity instead of sex is that it leads to the violation of personal and bodily integrity, particularly for minors. We now have a growing cohort of, they're called detransitioners, people who were abused by adults. They were placed on puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, had surgery all before they reached the age of 18, and now in their 20s they regret it. And so there's a reason why ordinarily we would say that if you're a minor, you can't make life-altering decisions like this. But when we do have gender identity recognized as a protected class in the law, you then have a civil right to engage in bodily harm.
Professor Ulrich, you have 2 minutes to respond.
Okay, I'm going to go quick here because I'd like to try to touch on all of these. So one, the privacy concerns. This isn't really protected by binaries, right? So I don't know if any men have been to sporting events, right, where you have to pee in a giant trough, right? It's actually extremely unprivate. And personally, I don't really want to participate in those. For women, right, there's a long history, especially in sports, of saying you have to literally get naked in front of strangers to prove that you're a woman. Right? It's not exactly protecting their privacy necessarily, right? Safety. I haven't been to prison, so I don't know, but I don't think that the binary is necessarily making prisons safe exactly. Right? Sexual assaults do happen in prisons currently. And if we're talking about sports, right, are we talking about sports or sports competitions? Right? There are non-physical sports. So this is not to say get rid of everything, right? But to say all competitions, right, should be treated the same way. Shooting in the Olympics, right? Is there any justifiable reason to say men and women have to be separated into different things? It also presumes that in all competitions, being, the argument goes, right, bigger, stronger is always better, right? I don't know about you, but I don't think Simone Biles would necessarily be afraid of competing against a man on the uneven bars. Equality, right? I don't know how many people have lost their spots on Olympic podiums to trans people. I'm pretty sure that it's actually quite limited, but there's also a question again of how are we defining this? So there are and have been high testosterone women. They are women, they are born women, they are raised women. They don't even know that they are high testosterone. And then it's all of a sudden decided, typically these are women of color, right, that come from other countries, right, the global south, and they say, well, actually you have to change your natural occurrences in your body for you to be the right type of woman to compete in these sports. And there's a ton of examples of this. Also, the 7th grade girl who from what I can tell, is pretty mediocre in cross country in West Virginia. I don't really think that's a safety concern or a quality concern necessarily. Detransitioners are about 1%, give or take, but there's also a question of why are they, detransitioning? Again, if you look at the trial courts, a lot of them, it's because they still have uncertainty, they found God, right, and they're struggling religiously. It's not that they necessarily are saying, oh, I was tricked into this and I don't necessarily agree. Also, regret happens in pretty much every area of medicine if you look at especially plastic surgery. I'm out of time, so I'll stop there.
Sure. So I think it's really almost callous and cold comfort to the women who have been sexually assaulted in jail by men to say, well, look, jail is an unsafe place anyway, so you had it coming to you. I think what we try to do is we try to do what we can on the front end to prevent and to minimize the likelihood of victimization. And that's one of the reasons why we have separate male and female facilities. The vast majority of sex crimes are committed by men. The vast majority of sex crime victims are women. And so when you're in a state of vulnerability, we try to separate men and women from each other so that men who are prone to commit sex crimes won't have ready access to victims, right? And so it's true that prisons are not as safe as they should be. I think we should lament that and we should work to reform it. But I don't think that then gives us like the permission slip to say, oh, and it's okay if we put men who identify as women into women's prison because they're already not that safe to begin with. I don't see the logic to that. Likewise, I mentioned there are two different types of concerns with athletics. Sometimes it's a safety concern. So one of the well-known examples here involves a championship MMA fighter, female fighter, championship fighter at MMA, went up against a man identifying as a woman. He broke her eye socket. And then in the interview afterwards, she said, I've never been so overpowered in all of my life. So yes, it does matter whether you, with a female body, are competing against someone else with a female body, or are you competing against someone who, quote, identifies as a female. Those are the safety concerns. The equality concerns, yes, it matters if you're an Ivy League swimmer and you lose a chance to win the championship race because Leah Thomas, who was a mediocre male swimmer, is now competing his senior year as a woman, right? Unless you want to say that it just doesn't matter who actually wins these races, unless you want to say it doesn't matter that we have male and female competition to begin with, why would we do it based upon an inner sense of gender, whatever that is? Or does what matter is bodily differences that make a difference, right? But if it's an inner sense of gender, just get rid of separate athletic competitions, right? So I think the logical conclusion here would either be everything should be gender neutral bathrooms, locker rooms, sports teams, prisons, or we should recognize bodily differences that make a difference, and therefore when they actually make a difference, they don't make a difference in a lecture hall, they do make a difference in a locker room or on an athletic field or in a prison. Those are the alternatives as I see them.
Well, thank you both for your opening remarks and rebuttals. We're about to turn it over to a Q&A in the audience. I'm just going to ask a question of each of you to allow them a chance to ruminate. The first one will be for you, Professor Ulrich, related to your arguments. As somebody who's obviously, very well versed in the law and centers around questions concerning health and law, my question is related to aspects of things like freedom of speech and other people's personal privacy whenever you expand the law to go outside of the range of gender or outside of the range of just binary sex. So, obviously there's been talk in recent years about bills in places like Canada which would prohibit, or would mandate that employers and other people use, say, preferred pronouns as opposed to biological pronouns. And, that makes complications, especially in a place like the United States, for freedom of speech. So how does your side of the argument sort of grapple with questions related to freedom of speech?
Sure, yeah. So, one thing I think is important to keep in mind is freedom of speech is a constitutional right against government action, right? So, I teach at Boston University. I can't call anybody whatever I want, right? And not in terms of pronouns or what you prefer, right? If I just say, oh, this idiot over here, right? I can be fired because they're a private company that said, we're hiring you, and if you don't do the job, right? And so I think that it is about, in that sort of circumstance, right, it's about creating an educational environment. And I think part of that is trying to be inclusive in terms of making everybody feel comfortable, which includes different viewpoints and perspectives, right? So I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind. I think also, when we're talking about speech, there's a difference between the government saying, you're a doctor, right? You need to do your job to some extent, right? But there are laws that say you don't have to perform an abortion if you don't want to, right? There are things that allow you to exempt yourself out. And all of this is to say, this is not easy, right? There are rights conflicts. Your First Amendment speech and then my right to religion, right? Your right to bodily autonomy and my right to Fourth Amendment. All these things come in conflict all the time, and we're trying to figure out how to do this, but to create sort of this like false dichotomy of it's all either speech and those rights and none of these, or the alternative, I think that that is a problematic way to look at things.
So just for a very brief follow-up, give an example of, say, an employer who would say refuse to use the preferred pronouns of the individual. If the government legally recognized, a third sex, say an X option, would then there be some sort of lawsuit for discrimination based on, X gender? And is that, is there any sort of exemptions that you could imagine for businesses in the same way that doctors have religious exemptions to not perform abortions?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, so there would almost certainly be religious exemptions, right? So if you are a religious institution, you're probably going to be exempt. But if you are, again, open to everyone, then this is an employment law statutory issue. And so we are probably going to find out very soon whether gender identity qualifies under those statutory definitions. But I think, again, the point is that, why are you hiring that person, right? Either you want people to come and work for you and say, look, I want you all to be recognized, I value all of you, this is a welcome environment, or I value you if you are this type of person, right? If you don't do these things that I don't necessarily agree with. And again, if that's how people want to run their business, that's one thing. But again, if you qualify under certain discriminatory statutes or anti-discrimination statutes, then that is a different issue legally.
Right.
Yeah.
And for you, Mr. Anderson, related to the similar topic of discrimination, I'm just very curious about how your side sort of tackles the topic of discrimination, particularly in something like hiring. I think outside of the realm of, physical activity like sports or like prison was another example that was thrown around, right? We have other laws that say that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, right, in terms of hiring practices when it's equally likely to be able to do the job. And so how does your side sort of tackle the notion of an X gender or an X sex legally in terms of discrimination, and how should people approach that?
Yeah, great question. So the way that this would likely happen wouldn't be like an X gender or sex. It would be making gender identity a protected class, either by saying the word sex means gender identity, or doing what Justice Gorsuch did in Bostock, saying transgender status is protected under Title VII employment law. But let me give you a concrete example. This was Section 1557 of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of sex. And then in May of 2016, HHS issued a regulation saying the word sex now means gender identity. And so I'm quoting from the Washington Post. What the rule says is if you provide a particular service to anybody, you can't refuse to provide it to anyone, said Sarah Warbelow, the legal director for the Human Rights Campaign. That means a transgender person who shows up at an emergency room with something as basic as a twisted ankle can not be denied care, as sometimes happens, Warbelow said. That also means if a doctor provides breast reconstruction surgery or hormone therapy, those services cannot be denied to transgender patients seeking them for gender dysphoria, she said. All right, so I think one of these things is not like the other. If a patient shows up at the emergency room with a twisted ankle, they should be treated regardless of how they identify. The Washington Post says that, Sarah Warbelow says that this sometimes happens. I can't find any documented evidence that it has happened. And if it were to happen, there would be news stories. Transgender patient denied emergency room care. Throughout COVID, there were no cases of someone being denied treatment or the vaccine or anything like that because they identify as transgender. If that were to happen, I would be the first saying that's unjust discrimination, right? If a patient shows up with something like a twisted ankle, they should be treated. That's different than she pivoted to say that, and then she said the rule also says that if you do breast reconstruction surgery or hormone therapy, and let's say you do it for a man that has low testosterone, or you do it for a woman that had a double mastectomy for breast cancer, now you have to do breast reconstruction to restore her breast tissue, or restore something that resembles breast tissue. Saying where it's medically necessary, medically appropriate, medically indicated, double mastectomy in the case of cancer, a hysterectomy in the case of cancer, hormone therapy for someone with low sex hormones. And then saying civil rights law now says it's also required when you as the physician think it's not medically necessary. So the regulation that came out in 1557, it had no religious liberty exemptions, it had no conscience protections, and it had no considerations at all for the best medical judgment of the doctor. Right? There are some physicians that think hormone therapy and breast reconstruction are appropriate treatments for adults, but inappropriate for minors. The regulation also had no consideration for the age of the patient. So someone who says, look, I'm not going to perform double mastectomy on a 13-year-old girl because I don't think it's age appropriate, would have run afoul of the Biden era and Obama era regulation on 1557. And I think that's a mistake. So how I think about discrimination is that we actually need to be a little bit more fine-tuned and to say whether or not you're discriminating based on the person's identity, not treating the twisted ankle, or do we have a valid disagreement about what good medicine looks like, not performing the double mastectomy on the 13-year-old girl.
Well, thank you both for your responses. I'll be now going around to audience members to pick on people for some questions. If you have a question, just please stand up if you're able and introduce yourself, and I will hand you the microphone. It's just for the
Hello? Oh, yeah, it's a fake microphone. So this question is directed towards Mr. Anderson. Also, hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a Yale sophomore studying political science with a certificate in education studies. So I happen to agree with you that surgeons shouldn't be doing breast reconstruction surgery on trans 13-year-olds. However, if you look at the research, more than 90% of the surgeries, gender-affirming surgeries done on minors, that's for cisgender minors who have a high, a hormone imbalance, maybe they had early development. And I want to go, so we talked a lot about biology and we talked a lot about safety, and you bring up the point that having sex as the default rather than gender identity protects women. And you talk about men masquerading as women, and I want to say a couple statistics. So according to the Human Nature Journal and the Trevor Project, which is a nonprofit organization that works for LGBTQ youth to protect them, anti-trans laws make transgender non-binary people 72% more likely to commit suicide. The mortality rate for transgender people is about 5 times higher than it is for cisgender people, specifically transgender women versus cisgender women. And you talk about men who dress up as women, there's a word for that. It's called drag queens. So there is a question. I know how to ask a question, but thank you for providing useless commentary. So my question is, with this information, how is it safe to dictate that gender is only related to sex, and also ban gender-affirming care, knowing that it increases suicide rates, not because it's not miserable to be trans because being trans sucks. It's miserable to be trans because there are people in this government and people who have good intentions but are similar to you, think that it's dangerous, and they want to ban gender-affirming care, knowing that it increases the suicide rate, knowing that it decreases the safety of these individuals who when they pursue top surgery, when they're old enough, the regret rate is 1% compared to 14% for all surgeries. So with that information in mind, does your opinion change?
No, because I was already aware of all of those studies from the Trevor Project, and I don't think most of them are actually quite good methodologically. But no, you asked your question, so I'm going to answer now, just for the sake of time, because obviously there are other people. A couple things to say. First, you said that many of the surgeries are actually being performed on cisgender people, and I don't think that's quite right. What we have evidence from private insurance reimbursements for so-called gender-affirming care is that between 2017 and 2023, over 5,000 teenage girls had double mastectomies performed on them. That was not because of a hormone imbalance. Those were because those were girls who were told by adults that they were actually boys and that they would feel more comfortable if they had their breasts, please don't interrupt, if they had their breasts removed. I think that what happened to those 5,000 minors is a travesty. 50 of those girls were under the age of 12 and a half. I think these young people are too young to have any idea what it means to be a boy or a girl or both or neither, and it's perfectly appropriate for the law to say that adults cannot remove the healthy breast tissue from the healthy body of a minor. All right, so that's one answer. Second answer is that the states that have done this, and it was 19 states that did this in the year 2023. So one of the reasons that I don't trust some of the studies that you refer to is that it's way too soon to have done any rigorous social science on what the outcomes of those laws are. If 19, so there are 26 states that now have those laws, 19 of which were passed in 2023. We're in March of 2025. When was the data collection, the data analysis, and how long in the time period would you actually see the outcomes that you're referring to? But the American states that have done this are within the mainstream of what's going on in the rest of the world, right? So if you look at what's happening in most of the European nations that pioneered the so-called Dutch protocol, which then got applied in the United States, the so-called gender-affirming care. Countries like Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, the United Kingdom, like not exactly the Bible Belt of Europe, they have all changed course on puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgery for minors. The largest report here was the CAS review that came out last year. It's a 388-page report. It included 9 different studies, 8 of which were systematic reviews of all of the literature. It was conducted by the former president of the Royal College of Pediatric and Child Health. Again, not a right-wing ideologue from Alabama or something like this. What they determined was that there was no evidence to justify doing so-called gender-affirming care on minors. And that's why most of the European nations that pioneered this are now turning back. The quote that Dr. Cass gave, she said that this was in her New York Times interview. She said she, quote, has enormous respect for the American Academy of Pediatrics, but then she said the group is, quote, holding on to a position that is now demonstrated to be out of date by multiple systematic reviews. So I just think that, some of the data you're relying on, some of the data that the American-based gender medical professionals is just inaccurate, which is why we're seeing evidence-based medicine in Europe and in Canada go in a different direction.
Thanks, everybody. I just want to remind everybody to try and keep your questions as succinct as possible, just so we can get to everybody. Appreciate it.
While you're going around, I just want to add that none of those countries have actually banned gender-affirming care, and the CAS review also does not advocate for a complete ban. All of them say there maybe should be other steps and other things to ensure that it only is used when medically necessary, but none of those countries have complete bans, and the review, which was done by a secret group of clinicians that we have no idea who they are, but we do know that a majority of them said that they don't believe that transgender people exist, right? That's not real, participated in that, right? So I think that those are important contextual points too.
So I didn't say that they banned them. I said they were no longer using them as routine care for children with gender dysphoria. Routine care is going to be psychotherapy and various forms of talk therapy.
And it's not routine care. Sorry,
and then it would be used as experimental treatment, which is what it is, right? So it's being treated as an experimental, whereas in the United States, it's treated as a civil right. So just realize the disparity here, right? Some people want to say it's a civil right that the minor receive the double mastectomy. Europe says that's a last resort as an experimental treatment only after exhausting all of the other therapeutic options.
So with many types of care, so if a young person wanted to do a gastric bypass, they want to lose weight that way, they want to enhance their breast. There are girls in cliques that may want to do that. There is a protocol. Once you have a child and you decide that you want to have your tubes tied, there is a waiting period. There are sound medical practices that are already in place for some of these things. In terms of gender identity, I just happened to pull up something, and I'm not sure if you are familiar with these. It's from my chart,
Okay.
and I'm on that council. And I didn't realize I could pick so many. Okay, so top option, choose not to disclose. Female, gender nonconforming, gender queer, intersex, male, other, transsexual, transgender female, transgender male. How much of this is biology and how much of this is really, okay, I'm self-selecting? Is there going to be a check on, is there a measure that's possible, especially for sports, to say, okay, if your X hormone level is in this range, you are allowed to compete on the female team or on the male team. It goes both ways. Is this something that you've seen before? Is this something that you think is worthwhile developing, to have this sort of list of things people select from, and maybe the doctor can select, that they can actually have a conversation about before they do procedures?
Is that for me, for Michael, for both? Okay.
Because you're awesome. Thank you.
All right, so just a couple brief thoughts. I think there are an infinite number of personalities and that there are two sexes. And so if we are going to have a legal document that lists our sex, it should say what our sex is, and then you can express your sex however you want, right? I don't think it matters who wears pants and who wears skirts, who wears dresses. Like, you can have an infinite variety of ways of being a man or a woman. But if you know, if this is, you said it was from the My Chart.
So it's from Epic, which
Okay.
is the nationwide system that doctors put all your information
Yep.
into. And then this is the
So your question was, is this based on biology or something else? Biology does not say if you're gender queer or gender non-binary or various of the other options that you mentioned. But the doctor might want to know if you're a man or a woman. Because if you're a male or a female, it has real consequences for what sort of dosage you should receive of medicine. Male and female bodies respond differently to different drugs. There are different interactions. There are different dosage questions. It also matters if you show up in the ER and your driver's license says that you're a man when you actually are experiencing an ectopic pregnancy, or you're pregnant and they don't think to check, right? And so you can see how there are real life health consequences. If we don't recognize biological sex, we recognize something else, and then by the time someone realizes that this is actually someone identifying as a man or a woman, when they're in reality something else, it may be too late for the treatment that they deserved.
I'll just add that I think there are data reasons that it's useful to track all of those things, even if that's just self-identified. But again, I think whether you're intersex would be an important thing for the clinician to know. I think it's also an important thing for the actual person to know. The amount of people that find out well into life, and then this has been shown to have a drastic impact on their ability to form intimate relationships, right? To trust when your parents and your clinicians, as you are an infant, do something to you and then don't tell you, right? That has a lasting impact. And so I think that there are, a lot of things built into that, right? That are really about what are the best ways to treat people, right? And to run a, efficient and effective healthcare system.
Hi, both, and thank you so much for being here today. I thought, sorry, Mr. Anderson, Dr. Anderson?
Ryan is fine.
Ryan. I thought, Ryan, you had potentially great critiques for recognizing gender within government, but it does still seem to gloss over the idea of intersex people existing in the context of biological sex. You even mentioned the boxer who does not identify as a transgender woman, that they were recognized as being a woman but have a complicated biological reality that then got used to say, actually, she is a man because of XYZ reasons. I'm curious what the critique of recognizing that there are a subset of people who have a really complicated biological existence and glossing over that fact for the sake of expediency rather than recognizing a real human experience that exists. And if I can add one addendum to that, I forgot the addendum, so I'll end there. Thank you.
If it comes back, yeah. Let me say, I did not mean to gloss over this. I intended to actually draw attention to it, that there are disorders of sexual development. I don't think intersex is an accurate term to use. I think it's actually inaccurate. The medical term is disorders of sexual development. The problem with intersex is it makes it sound like there are people who are inter the two sexes or somehow in between. Everyone is either a male or a female, even people with disorders of sexual development. There isn't a spectrum between males and females, although there are developmental disorders, just like there are developmental cardiac disorders. We call it heart disease. Developmental respiratory disorders, we call it lung disease. There can be developmental reproductive disorders, which means that you would end up being infertile. You won't develop a complete reproductive system. Early on in Professor Ulrich's comments, he mentioned, XX and XY doesn't always determine the sex of an individual. That's true. 99% of the time it does. And the reason why it's not happenstance, but the reason why is that ordinarily the Y chromosome contains the SRY gene. A sex-determining region on Y is what that SRY gene stands for. And if you have the ability to respond to androgens, the SRY gene on that Y chromosome will lead your body to start producing androgens, which will then start to masculinize your body, all within the first 14 days in utero. But if your Y chromosome doesn't contain the SRY gene, you develop to be an infertile female. And we have no confusion about this. At birth, they're recognized as women. If you did a blood test, it would come back XY, but they don't struggle with their identity. Observers don't struggle with the identity. You could have an XY chromosome with the SRY gene, but suffer from complete androgen insensitivity syndrome. And you would have the right genetic composure, but as soon as you start producing androgens, your body is completely insensitive to it. So again, you would develop as an infertile female. So the reason I mention this is that for up until 2016, we had no trouble handling people who have disorders of sexual development. And the law defined sex as a bodily biological reality. It's only in 16 that we get DOJ, Department of Education, and HHS saying that for federal law, the word sex now means gender identity. Right? And so that's why I focus there, because we already had 200 some years, almost 250 years of legal experience in the states with respect to people with disorders of sexual development. The something new under the sun was saying, we're actually going to throw out the entire sex binary and say gender identity is now how we determine sex. And gender identity is both fluid and a spectrum.
I just want to respond. I mean, I don't think that there are states that said for all things that involve sex and gender, we are throwing it out. I mean, my understanding is here in Connecticut, there are still different sports and different prisons and things like that, right? So, I mean, part of what I am saying is not, as was suggested, everything's neutral, it's that the law should not and cannot define for everything across the board as there are only two things and everybody has to fall into one of those, right? And again, if we're going to say, yes, it is, and this person is a female because they look like a female, okay, so then we're going by appearance then, right? But there are a lot of things then that can change, right? I think Ohio or one of the states just proposed, you can't get a non-conforming haircut anymore, right? Is that the direction that we are going? I think that that's also problematic if we're worried about, freedoms and liberties and equality and things like that. And the other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is we also had transgender people and we had gender affirming care for almost a century, right? There were 0 states that had any restrictions on it at all until there was testing done by the American Principles Project, according to the president of the American Principles Project, that found out that something that would be advantageous politically would be to focus not on bathrooms, as North Carolina did in 2016, which went horribly wrong, but instead to focus on gender-affirming care for minors and to focus on female sports, right? And those two things, and all of a sudden it shot up, right? And so when you have organizations like Alrich that say, here, we've written a law and it's sent out to all of the states, and then they just sort of say, okay, right, let's not pretend like this was some sort of, science-based, medically driven, rise or exponentially in terms of, regulation of this medical care all of a sudden.
Can I say something in response to that? So I think it's worth pointing out that the first pediatric gender clinic in the United States opened in 2007. So it's not a century of so-called gender-affirming care for minors. It's more like 18 years at this point. And at first there were very few. It was experimental. It was, the first one opened at Boston Children's Hospital. It was, associated with Harvard. And the reason, so just to clarify the timeline, the reason that you're now seeing so many people speaking out against this is precisely because it wasn't a purely partisan political measure. This is now an 80-20, sometimes 70-30 issue. The reason Trump ran all of those ads during college football games and Sunday NFL games, she's for they, them, he's for you, is that this resonates with ordinary Americans who think there's something wrong about performing a double mastectomy on a 13-year-old girl. And you don't need to be a conservative, you don't need to be a Christian, you don't need to be fill in any of the, which is why you're now seeing so many LGBs speaking out against the T, right? And I've worked with many of these people. I hosted many of them in DC, and one of the first things they said, I hosted an event where we had the first lesbian who was reinstated to the military after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was listed. And the first thing she said was, thank you to the Heritage Foundation for giving me what no group on the left would give, a platform. And so I think it's been a mistake for many of the left-wing groups to think that trans rights were going to play out the same way that gay rights played out, and that this was just going to be like steamrolled on. 2015, you get Obergefell. 2016, we're going to say sex now means gender identity, and everyone will just get along with it. Last thing I'll say, because of this sports situation, and mentioning that we're here in Connecticut, look at concrete examples, right? So the ground zero for some of the lawsuits involving sports were Connecticut track athletes who lost championship races to people who are obviously boys, right? There's no disputing, they don't dispute it, no one disputes the facts. The facts of the case are straightforward. These are boys who in high school started identifying as girls, and then they started competing as girls. Has nothing to do with disorders of sexual development, nothing to do with intersex conditions. And so the question is, if we are going to have in Connecticut separate athletic competitions for boys and girls, for men and women, what determines who's eligible to compete in which category? Is it based upon the body and bodily reality, or is it based upon identity, subjective identity? So that if I claim in the state of Connecticut that my inner sense of gender is female, I have a legal right in Connecticut to compete as a female. And the question is that law just? I think that law is unjust. I think it's unfair to female athletes, and for all the other concerns, that, privacy concerns, safety concerns, et cetera, et cetera.
We have time for one very brief question before the closing remarks.
Thank you. So my question is for Dr. Anderson, and to give some very brief context, one of my very close friends suffered for 4 years as she was kept from getting care for her gender dysphoria, and as a child she knew that her, despite how everyone perceived her, that she was a girl. So when she became an adult, she sought care, was denied it for years and years until she came to a state where she could receive that care. So I want to know, why do you fear laws that can help these people, especially considering your arguments are based on fringe cases, and so many of the actual statistics come from people who have satisfactorily received care for their gender dysphoria?
Sure. So I think two things to say in response. One is that I don't have any fear. I don't think I've said anything about being afraid. during this hour-long discussion. I have concerns, and I have concerns that those sorts of laws would actually undermine justice and the common good. So the reason I advocate for the laws and public policy that I do is that I think it serves justice, human dignity, and the common good, and I think the laws that you support undermine human dignity and justice and the common good. I don't think either of us are fearful of the other, although maybe you're fearful of me, I have no idea. But I think it's a problem to frame the discussion as, one side has fear. The best research that we have on this, much of it coming out of Europe right now, all suggests that the rush to engage in gender-affirming care to make puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones and surgeries on minors as the routine treatment is misguided. We now know, thanks to the Alabama litigation, that WPATH, the World Professional Association of Transgender Health Experts, is a political advocacy group. And during the documentation period where they got to discovery, they showed that they were cooking the books, in essence. They had consulted, yes, they had consulted with, quote, social justice lawyers who have told us that we can't say these things because it will be used against us in litigation. And if you read the amicus brief that the state of Alabama filed in this Scarametti case, it is damning. There is a scandal going on where medical experts have been lying to the public. And this isn't just what happened with COVID stuff. It's very kind of like poetic justice that yesterday Jay Bhattacharya, the Stanford medical doctor who was censored by Twitter at the behest of the Biden administration, was confirmed as the new director of NIH. So it's not just there, it's systemic, particularly in gender medicine. Joanna Olson Kennedy was conducting an NIH-funded study where she has refused, despite the fact that all of our tax dollars paid for this study, she has refused to publish the results of the study because the results undermine her politically motivated medical agenda. The results don't show that so-called gender-affirming care improve outcomes for the patients who have received it. And that's why she's sitting on it and she won't publish it. But the researchers in Europe who have conducted the studies and have published them show that there's, one, very low quality evidence. So just the evidence that out there is very low quality. And two, the evidence that we do have does not show that it provides benefits to the people who are promised it will benefit them. So that's why I don't support the medical treatments and the laws that you support. And that's why I do support the ones that I do.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for your questions. We'll have 3 minutes from each guest of closing statements, beginning with you, Mr. Anderson.
Sure. I mean, to a certain extent, I don't have too much to add because that question provided me a nice way of explaining my thinking on this. I'll just reiterate, as I see it, the reality here, metaphysical and biological, physical and metaphysical reality is that each and every one of us is either male or female. That's a fact for all mammalian species. And it would be odd to think that every mammalian species except for human beings comes as male or female, and we're the only ones that actually exist along the spectrum, and that our, quote, identity is fluid. I think using the law to recognize gender identity instead of sex actually results in incoherency. So that if I tomorrow decide I identify as female, there is nothing any of you could do to keep me out of female spaces or from competing on female teams. Which really does raise the question, then why do we have female-only spaces if it's going to be purely self-ID? And then lastly, I'll just say, look, the third point I made by opening, the 5 areas of concerns, privacy, safety, and equality, start there. Think about how we deal with racial discrimination versus sex discrimination. For all 3 of those things, we got rid of race-specific facilities, programs, spaces, and competitions because our skin color is irrelevant to what we do in the bathroom or the locker room or the sports field. By contrast, our sexual embodiment is very relevant to what we do in the bathroom, the locker room, and the sports field, which is why we have separate spaces and categories for boys and girls, for men and women. But we don't, thank God, have separate spaces or categories based upon racial identity or skin color. I think the liberty concerns here, imagine if you are a doctor who is forced to violate the Hippocratic Oath because the civil rights law now says that you must perform a double mastectomy on a 13-year-old girl, otherwise you're, quote, discriminating based on the patient's, quote, gender identity. Imagine likewise if you're a patient experiencing gender dysphoria and you can't receive care in your state because the law prohibits talk therapy as, quote, conversion therapy. And then lastly, imagine that you're one of these young people who wakes up at age 20, 21 to discover that you have been victimized by adults who should have known better, and that many of them did know better, and they refused to publish the results of their taxpayer-funded studies because the results were politically inconvenient. Imagine how those young people feel, not being able to nurse a baby because when they were 15 years old, doctors removed their breasts. That's why I'm motivated to do this work, and that's why I'm glad that the Buckley Institute is hosting this conversation.
Professor Ulrich. Liz.
I
have to close these statements.
So I want to start with, if we look at the maps of the states that are focused on, quote unquote, protecting or enforcing this gender binary, some of the justifications that are given are for women, right? These are the same states that have banned abortion, right? That have extreme restrictions such that some of the states are literally having to fly women out to other states to do it. If you look at some of the policymakers that are really pushing for this, right? There are also some of the ones that are saying, we really need to get rid of no-fault divorce, right? That was a real problem, right? So what we're talking about is, by protecting this gender binary, we need to recognize that it also protects the gender hierarchy that does and has always existed in this country, right? And who are the people then that advocate for those things? If we're talking about parents, right, these evil parents that are just out there, cutting the genitalia of their children because they think it's fun or cool or whatever, right? But then why are those same states saying, look, parental rights are the reason why we need to ban these books in school. Parents should have the right to determine what their kids learn and don't learn, right? And so the problem is there's an inconsistency in a lot of these arguments. Again, my point here, to be clear, is not to say everybody is whatever, everyone can do whatever and go wherever. Like, that is just not how organized society works. But my point is that we want to, or should at least say, everyone's involved, right? The law, the government represents the people, which is all people, right? And so if we want that to actually be how this country is, we need to figure out how to incorporate and include these people, right, without making them feel ostracized, right? And so that's not to say everybody should participate in whatever sport they want, but I don't think that we should be thinking about Olympics the same way that we're thinking about, middle school volleyball in a PE class, right? I don't think that, we should be thinking about, Division I collegiate athletics the same way that we do with T-ball, right? So, I think that they're part of the problem that I have with this. It's really simple. There's two sexes. Everyone's man, everyone's, or you're a woman. That's it. That's the end of the story, right? There's still, well, how do we choose? Who gets to choose? And when is this decision made? And, you are stuck with it forever, right? You have no say, right? If you are a DSD, right, which intersex people prefer the term intersex. I am not intersex or DSD, so I defer to them, right? Why do they not get some say in the matter, right? We can't trust parents, but the parents and the doctors that we can't trust are the ones that get to pick which sex this person's going to be as an infant, right? That is problematic. Again, if we go back to the sort of overarching point and the question that this debate started with, should the law categorically only recognize biological sex? Still, I don't have a clear understanding of how we would define that and why it has to apply everywhere, all the time, no matter what. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, that concludes our program for today. I want to first thank all of you for a very difficult but fruitful conversation. And if you all could please join me in thanking our guests one last time.